popular belief, the conduct of nations on the international stage is almost never driven by moral considerations, but rather by a shadowy cocktail of money and geopolitics. As such, when you see the mouthpieces of the ruling class begin to demonize a foreign country, the first question in your mind should always be what is actually at stake here. For some time now, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria have been in the crosshairs. Once you understand why, the events unfolding in the world right now will make much more sense. The US dollar is a unique currency. In fact, its current design and its relationship to geopolitics is unlike any other in history, though it has been the world reserve currency since 1944. This is not what makes it unique. Many currencies have held the reserve status off and on over the centuries. But what makes the dollar unique is the fact that since the early 1970s it has been, with a few notable exceptions, the only currency used to buy and sell oil on the globe. Prior to 1971, the US dollar was bound to the gold standard, at least officially, according to the IMF. By 1966, foreign central banks held $14 billion US dollars. However, the United States had only $3.2 billion in gold allocated to cover foreign holdings. Translation: the Federal Reserve was printing more money than it could actually back. The result was rampant inflation and a general flight from the dollar. In 1971, in what later came to be called the Nixon shock, President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard completely. At this point, the dollar became a pure debt-based currency. With debt-based currencies, money is literally loaned into existence. Approximately 70% of the money in circulation is created by ordinary banks, which are allowed to loan out more than they actually have in their accounts. The rest is created by the Federal Reserve, which loans money that they don't have, mostly to the government. It's kind of like writing hot checks, except it's legal for banks. This practice, which is referred to as fractional reserve banking, is supposedly regulated by the Federal Reserve, an institution which just happens to be owned and controlled by a conglomerate of banks, and no agency or branch of government regulates the Federal Reserve. Now, to make things even more interesting, these fractional reserve loans have interest attached, but the money to pay that interest doesn't exist in the system. As a result, there is always more total debt than there is money in circulation, and in order to stay afloat, the economy must grow perpetually. This is obviously not sustainable. Now you might be wondering how the dollar has maintained such a dominant position on the world stage for over 40 years if it's really little more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. Well, this is where the dollar meets geopolitics. In 1973, under the shadow of the artificial OPEC oil prices, the Nixon administration began secret negotiations with the government of Saudi Arabia to establish what came to be referred to as the petrodollar recycling system. Under the arrangement, the Saudis would only sell their oil in US dollars, and would invest a majority of their excess oil profits into US banks and capital markets. The IMF would then use this money to facilitate loans to oil importers who were having difficulties covering the increase in oil prices. The payments and interest on these loans would of course be denominated in US dollars. This agreement was formalized in the US-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, put together by Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in 1974. Another document released by the Congressional Research Service reveals that these negotiations had a net to them, as U.S. officials were openly discussing the feasibility of seizing oil fields in Saudi Arabia militarily. The system was expanded to include the rest of OPEC by 1975, though presented as a buffer to the recessionary effects of rising oil prices. This arrangement had a hidden side effect. It removed the traditional restraints on U.S. monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was now free to increase the money supply at will. The ever-increasing demand for oil would prevent a flight from the dollar, while distributing the inflationary consequences across the entire planet. The dollar went from being a gold-backed currency to an oil-backed currency. It also became America's primary export. Did you ever wonder how the U.S. economy has been able to stay afloat while running multi-billion-dollar trade deficits for decades? Did you ever wonder how it is that the U.S. holds such a disproportionate amount of world's wealth when 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-based. In the modern era, fossil fuels make the world go round. They have it into every aspect of civilization: agriculture, transportation, plastics, heating, defense and medicine, and demand just keeps growing and growing. As long as the world needs oil, and as long as oil is only sold in US dollars, there will be a demand for dollars, and that demand is what gives the dollar its value. For the United States, this is a great deal. Dollars go out, either as paper or digits in a computer system, and real tangible products and services come in. However, for the rest of the world, it's a very sneaky form of exploitation. Having global trade predominantly in dollars also provides Washington with a powerful financial weapon through sanctions. This is due to the fact that most large-scale dollar transactions are forced to pass through the U.S. This petrodollar system stood unchallenged until September of 2000, when Saddam Hussein announced his decision to switch Iraq's oil sales off of the dollar to euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar, and easily the most important geopolitical event of the year. But only one article in the Western media even mentioned it. In the same month that Saddam announced he was moving away from the dollar, an organization called the Project for a New American Century, of which Dick Cheney just happened to be a member, released a document entitled Rebuild as Defense's Strategy, Forces and Resources for a New Century. This document called for massive increases in U.S. military spending and a much more aggressive foreign policy in order to expand U.S. dominance worldwide. However, the document lamented that achieving these goals would take many years, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year later they got it. Writing the emotional reaction to 9/11. The Bush administration was able to invade Afghanistan and Iraq and pass the Patriot Act all without any significant resistance. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this wasn't a question of bad intelligence. This was a cold, calculated lie, and the decision to invade was made in full knowledge of the disaster which would follow. They knew exactly what was going to happen, but in 2003, they did it anyway. Once Iraqi oil fields were under U.S. control, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar. Mission accomplished. Soon after the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration attempted to extend these wars to Iran. Supposedly, the Iranian government was working to build a nuclear weapon. After the Iraq fiasco, Washington's credibility was severely damaged. As a result, they were unable to muster international or domestic support for an intervention. Their efforts were further sabotaged by elements within the CIA and Mossad, who came forward to state that Iran had not even made the decision to develop nuclear weapons, much less begin an attempt. However, the demonization campaign against Iran continued even into the Obama administration. Why? Well, might it have something to do with the fact that since 2004 Iran has been in the process of organizing an independent oil force? They were building their own oil market, and it wasn't going to be tied to the dollar. The first shipments of oil were sold through this market in July of 2011. Unable to get the war that they wanted, the U.S. used the UN to impose sanctions against Iran. The goal of the sanctions was to topple the Iranian regime.